St. Luke's, I cannot tell you just how thankful I am to get to meet you in person finally. It is an honor to be here with you. I have had the absolute privilege of getting to hear about your story, the people that you are, the church that you are together, the church that God has needed you to be for and with Canning Town, so that God's kingdom could be on earth as it is in heaven in this place. And friends, it has been a joy to be here for the last week. Thank you for your hospitality. Thank you for being who you are, for inspiring churches, not just here in the UK, but all the way in Virginia on the east coast of the United States to keep chasing after what the Holy Spirit is up to. I'm amazed because I've heard about the relationships that you have with the folks here at the school as you share a building and a mission together. To the neighbors with whom you are planted with, rooted with here in this community, to the long and steady presence that you have been as St. Luke's here in this city. Your faithfulness to me is inspiring. The food bank partnerships, CAP courses, meals, friendships, they are such a gift. Just some of the beautiful ways that I've heard how you share in the work of following Jesus together. I just want to tell you that Amy, Pastor Amy, she raves about you. She raves about you. And not because of the way pastors sometimes rave about their churches, because they're like, whoo, these folks have got me strung out and running like crazy. She raves about you because of how faithfully you follow after Jesus for the sake of this community. She's proud of the ways that you put your faith into practice. She's proud of the ways that you have lived with purpose for the sake of others. She's so grateful to have partners who are living on mission with God as a church in this community. The statement that you want to build bridges with your community is one of the most amazing statements to me. It's amazing because you're one of those churches who is doing much more than putting a nice slogan on a sign. You're a church that is putting that dream, that heart calling into practice. You're not just talking about it. You're not ignoring it with your life. You're following Jesus like that. You actually live this stuff out. You're building bridges with your community, for your community together. Seeing the work of St. Luke's close up for me has helped me as a guy all the way from the States to see Jesus with greater joy this week. So it's a joy and an honor to be here. As you've been fasting together over the last few weeks, I wish I was here for the celebration in a couple of days, because I imagine after 24 days of fasting, you're really excited for Wednesday. But today, as you've been working through Luke over the last couple of weeks, today we're going to talk about what does it look like for us to mature and grow in a specific area of our lives. Like a child who moves from adolescence and a teenager into adulthood, what does it mean for us to grow up? How do we be intentional to learn and grow so that we can learn to hit our stride with a certain area of our life? Whether it's our relationships, our connection to God, our faith, how is it that we can take steps to mature so we don't stay in the shallow end of the pool our whole lives? But let's be real with each other for just a moment. Growing into adolescence is kind of awkward at times. Our voice changes, starts to crack a little bit. All of a sudden, all this work and sweat that we start to build up makes us a little smelly to one another. The journey from immaturity into maturity can feel a little awkward at times. But have you ever met an adult in your life who has gotten up in age but never really grown up? Do you know someone who has gotten up in age but never really become an adult? Never really been able to get past some of the roadblocks that have come into their lives? These are the kinds of folks that seem to leave everyone around them cleaning up their messes instead of ever asking, what can I do so that my life might be different? They talk a big game, but when you look at their life, it doesn't resemble some of the words that they say. Have you ever been around someone who's more interested in you seeing what they do the acts of kindness or generosity rather than the act of kindness and generosity if it actually benefits someone else. Like they're more interested in you watching them than about what they're actually doing. You see this sometimes with people who seem to be more interested to show up to a place, to do something kind for someone, and they just want to make sure that a really good photo gets taken of them so that they can get a lot of likes on Instagram, so that their YouTube page blows up. Like they're doing all of this service, this good, so that people see them rather than for the people they serve. It's not a very nice feeling when someone does something good. And maybe you're on the receiving end of that good that they're trying to do, but they just want you to perceive them as the hero of the story. It's not like they actually want your life to be better. Doing something for the show of it rather than doing it because it's right and honoring of God and people, it's really the epitome of what it means to be a hypocrite. The hypocrite is someone who sort of wears a mask so that they appear one way while underneath the mask there's someone else. It's like a person playing a role in a movie or a TV show. They take on the role of that character even though that character isn't who they really are. Some folks like to put on a show when they serve other people, don't they? Look at me. I'm so great. I'm so special. I think this is one of the biggest criticisms of Christianity, that churches will talk about money and the importance of sacrificial giving and life, but then they use money as a prop to serve themselves instead of serving others. I remember one time I met with someone at a church that I was serving at, and they loved to talk to me about their nice home and their cars, even their holiday home that they like to visit on vacation, places they traveled to. And then they told me that their giving to the church was contingent upon how they thought the pastor and the people voted politically. Ooh, what was that about? It had nothing to do with the relationship with God. It had to do with perceptions, and it had to do with making sure that they felt comfortable. Money makes us do weird things sometimes, doesn't it? Money and power makes us do even weirder things. Money, power, and religion, when it's not examined, can take us down some very terrible paths. When our maturity in relation to money and power and religion leaves something to be desired, I think that Jesus is trying to reveal to us some of the most important things from the scriptures about how money and power and religion can sometimes get us off on the wrong track. People can love to put on a show instead of simply trying to do what's right in order to honor God. We all have the ability to do these kinds of things in our lives, to behave in this way, to confuse each other, to distract people from God. But I think sometimes the way we think we arrive at maturity in life, in our relationships, we think that there's some like magic button that we can press, and all of a sudden we go from being an immature person into a mature person. But the reality is there are no shortcuts in life, are there? We try, but it usually never works out. Instead, we respond to grace and we take a step. We respond to grace and take a step. We respond to grace and take a step. I'm convinced that we all want the benefits of a mature life with Jesus. Does anybody want to have healthy relationships? Yeah. Does anybody want to have meaningful marriages? Does anybody want to have a healthy rhythm of work and rest and play? Anybody want to have healthy finances where you are faithful to God but also living a sustainable life and not worried about what you have so that you can eat? We want our finances, our emotions, our lives, our physical lives. We want them to feel less like a last-minute project that just falls apart after we finish. We want to experience maturity in our lives, but we rarely reflect on what it takes to get there. So today I want to ask, how is God inviting you to grow? You see, the pathway from immature to mature is made a step at a time. We often think of our lives as either good or bad, right or wrong, but most of our life is actually like on a spectrum. It's like maybe immaturity is over here and maturity is over here. So I just want you to imagine for a moment a place in your life where you've sensed through this time of fasting and prayer over the last few weeks where God's saying, you know what, I actually want you to grow. I want you to move from immaturity into maturity. Maybe it's you sense that God wants you to grow in the way you navigate conflict. Maybe it's in an area of finances in your life, about trusting God instead of thinking that God doesn't care. Where are you in your maturity level in that thing that God's inviting you to grow on? Are you immature? Are you mature? Most of us are somewhere in the middle, right? We know that God's trying to do something in us, but we have to bring that and name that before God. We are nearing the end of Luke's gospel today. Jesus has already begun his journey to Jerusalem, a journey to the cross, to show us how costly grace is, to show us how powerful his love for us is in our lives. And Jesus has been challenging the religious leaders one step at a time. He's warning the rich. And it's like everyone around him can't understand why Jesus would purposely keep trying to wrestle with the religious leaders when he knows that they're getting angrier and angrier and angrier, and they're going to try to kill him. So we come to this story. Jesus is gathered with some of his disciples, and the group is a little bit larger than just the 12. And Jesus just gives them a straight warning. Doesn't really mince any words. He says, watch out for the religious scholars and teachers of the law. They like to walk around in their flowing robes, to be greeted with respect and honor in public, to have the best seats in worship and places of honor at special gatherings. They exploit the helpless, and they make a show out of their lengthy prayers. These are folks who have made a show out of their lives. Like they're dressing up for the part somehow fools everyone into thinking that they're living this stuff out in their relationships. It's funny how clear Jesus is that sometimes the way we dress for worship and our traditions can actually hide who we really are on the inside. It's so important that we begin part of worship by confessing our brokenness to God and each other, right? To name it out loud. But this is one of the most common criticisms from our neighbors. They can't understand why Christians want to appear pious, they want to appear serious, they want to appear like we are taking our life and relationships seriously, and yet our neighbors see us talking one way, acting one way in religious settings, and then talking and acting another way in our everyday lives. They're not the same. These are religious leaders and people who somehow try to take God and make other people feel small. There are a couple of times in my life when people have made me feel small. People who I've looked up to or admired, had them treat me with the kind of contempt that Jesus talks about here. One of those times, I was actually training to become a pastor. So you would think that when you're training to become a pastor, the people who are training you are really excited to grow you as a pastor because you have the gift of getting to serve a people like this, like you. It's such a beautiful thing. I was training to be a pastor. I was a pretty good student. I had decent grades. I worked hard, but I was intimidated by the process of becoming a pastor. We had this huge gathering where all the seminary students were about to graduate, had a chance to meet their professors and other people with, flowing robes, teachers, the folks that you would look up to in the faith. And one of my professors brought me over to the sort of head of our school. He wanted to introduce me as a new graduate, a new pastor getting ready to go onto the field, and that head of school would not look up from his phone and instead didn't even greet me by name. Here I am, training to be a pastor, and one of the people training pastors to be pastors lived out this story for me in real time. This story of what it looks like when religious people are pompous and arrogant, and they treat you like you are something less than. There might have been a time in my life where I thought busyness was next to godliness. Like the more activity I had in my life and the more productive I was, then I was more likely to earn my place of favor before God. But something cracked open in me that day with religious leaders that the head of the seminary to train pastors was acting like he was too good to be bothered. And I realized in that moment that I could become just like that any one of us can try to make a show of our faith instead of living it out with purpose and sincerity. So one of the ways that we grow in maturity is to match humility with our actions and sort of leave the show of religion behind. The holiest and most Christ-like people I know have a faith that is much more humble and kind. They don't make their faith like a reality TV show. What's some of the reality TV shows that are here? Do you know what a reality TV show is? What are the ones that everybody likes to watch? In the U.S., it's The Bachelor. What other TV shows do you have? You don't want to tell me? There's no judgment. This is a judgment-free zone, okay? Love Island. There we go. Okay. Right? The Resistance? Oh, yeah. Sometimes we have people who act like they're on like a reality TV show with their faith instead of actually like living it out with real people. But one of the times that I experienced the flip side of people who were so kind and humble about their faith was over the last couple of years, my wife and I, we've been raising my brother's 4 children. My wife and our 2 sons and our family of 4 became a family of 8 overnight. And as the pastor of the church, to be honest, my family just needed help. We needed help with food and school, medical issues, money. We had not been prepared for this moment in our lives. And it was so humbling as a pastor to be someone who is meant to lead, to say, we can't do this. We're overwhelmed. But there were people in our church, in our community, who were more generous with my family than I could have ever imagined. People who love my family so well by providing resources for us, by helping us when we are in need, providing trips to doctors, and all these other ways of helping us make it through a really difficult season of life. Now, those folks could have treated me with contempt. They could have made a show of the way they loved and served my family in the midst of a very difficult time. But instead, my family was forever changed by the generosity and humble gifts that those folks shared with us in that season. The way that I would talk about this kind of mature, generous faith is that mature people serve first and leave last. Mature people serve first and leave last. Mature followers of Jesus are the kinds of folks that seek out opportunities to serve before they are served. I really love being here at St. Luke's because the first church I ever got to pastor and be a part of also met in a school. When I walked in and the chairs were being set up and the sound was being set up and the cameras and the lights and the movement, in order to be able to worship God together, I felt like I was at home with people who understood what it means to be enmeshed in the community, because this place is a place where children are getting to hear good news about God every day, learning, having a safe place to grow up, and a church understands its need to be that deeply connected to the neighborhood. One of the ways that we used to sort of try to grow maturity when we used to meet for worship in schools, to develop a heart of service, is that before anyone was ever allowed to sing or read in public or have sort of a public role, is that we asked them to actually serve for 3 months, just helping set up and break down before anyone ever saw them on a platform. We just wanted to know, could they serve without getting attention, right? Before people would think something special about them. Friends, I think this is one of the main qualifications of being a disciple of Jesus. We have to look for opportunities to give back before asking people to serve us. I know that there are so many people here today and worshiping online with us who live this out at St. Luke's. Folks who would be embarrassed if you said their names out loud, who model for you what it looks like to live generously with their heart and time. They show up early, they stay late, they give back generously, they serve without applause. In my own church, I think of Gay and Rick Blankenship, this couple who make sure that every family who loses a loved one has a funeral reception so that they know that they can celebrate the life of that person they've lost with their people and family and friends. I think of the audio team that sets up and gets there early every Sunday to make sure that people can see and hear worship together. I think of Pam and Andy Stiles, who make sure that every single person who walks into our church building knows that they are loved and seen and they belong and they matter to God. I think of Lily Cameron and her team, who makes sure that every single refugee family who moves into our community knows that whether they can speak the language or have a home or have resources or not, that they belong and are seen by God. I think of Linda and Chris Kennedy and our army of volunteers who make sure that people have food every week. And I could go on with people who help me to see Jesus because they just serve. And if they find out that I mentioned them in the sermon today, all the way at home, I'll probably have emails from them embarrassed and frustrated with me. But I've got a long plane ride before they can get mad at me. When we are serve first and leave last kinds of people, we help folks to know that there's a God who loves them, has served them, and stayed after, been with them, cares for them. And instead of seeking power and prestige and honor from others, they just serve first because they're so desperate for people to see Jesus. Jesus brings this point home by telling another story. And this comes from Eugene Peterson's translation in the Message. He says, "Just then he looked up and saw the rich people dropping offerings in the collection plate. Then he saw a poor widow put in 2 pennies, and he said, 'The plain truth is that this widow has given by far the largest offering today. All these others made offerings that they'll never miss. She gave extravagantly what she couldn't afford. She gave her all.'" We often think that generosity is connected to an amount, that the amount of something is a generous gift. That's a generous amount of food. That's a generous donation. That's a generous action. But what really makes something generous? You see, the rich in this story give a greater amount financially, but Jesus says that the widow who gave 2 small coins gave more extravagantly, more generously than the people who gave large amounts. What does that mean? How can a smaller gift be more generous? I think what Jesus wants us to hear and see through the life of this generous widow is that mature generosity is sacrificial. You know balloons, the ones you blow up for like birthday parties, things like that? When you blow them up really big and they're like very full, when you let a little bit of air out, you don't really notice, right? But when the balloon starts to get filled with less and less air and you let a little bit out, it makes a big difference. It starts to get like flabby. loose, right? It makes a big difference when just a little bit goes out. Mature generosity is like that. It's costly. It might make you feel a little flat at times. And this doesn't mean that God doesn't want us to gain wealth. It means that whatever resources that God blesses us with and that we grow in our lives, we have to look to be sacrificially generous in our worship of God as an investment in the kingdom that God is building on earth as in heaven. We want to grow to be the kinds of people who live out a generosity that is sacrificial. We want to make room for something that costs us a little bit. We want to look for ways to grow our faith and not our confidence in ourselves. So what does this look like in your core relationships, in your marriages, in your friendships? What does this look like with your financial resources? What about your life with the church? What about the places in Canning Town where God's love is breaking through? How might your neighbors see Jesus through the sacrificial gifts you make as an act of worship to God? Generosity is learning to be honest with yourself about when you have enough and being generous with all that you have as an act of worship before God. So this week, what does it look like for you to live and love generously with others? What if your neighbors could identify religious people not for their clothes, not for their proximity to a building, not for their rules, not for their hypocritical actions? What if St. Luke's could continue to be known as a church that loves with sacrificial generosity? What if your relationships here in this place were marked by a serve first and leave last heart for connection? Would you pray with me? God, I'm reminded that earlier in this Gospel of Luke, there's the story of a young child bringing 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish that feeds over 5,000 people. Sometimes we think we have to have a lot before we can give a lot. Sometimes we think that we have to accumulate first, build trust in ourselves before we can trust you. But Lord, help us to have the faith of that widow who didn't just give a lot because it was a lot of money. She gave a lot because she trusted and depended on you. Thank you for being the kind of God who multiplies what we feel like is small and then doing more than we could possibly hope or imagine. God, help us to be faithful. Help us to be faithful to you, to practice shalom with our neighbors, even if it means being good to those who we don't agree with. God, help us to seek the flourishing of our neighborhoods, to be generous with our resources, to love and to give sacrificially, so that people understand that we are much more than our religious rules or traditions about how we live or eat or what clothes we wear, but that we follow a God who sees us in the midst of our brokenness, loves us, invites us into a mature life with you. God, help us to be the kinds of people who are known for your love more than anything else in our lives. God, thank you for your love, for your goodness, your kindness towards us. Grow in us a sacrificial generosity for the sake of our neighbors. And it's in Jesus' name, in good hope that we pray. Amen.